There's no way to guarantee that any construction project will stand the test of time. An unusual design doesn't guarantee that people will always come to look at something, and spending millions of dollars on a project doesn't always mean that other people will consider it to be valuable. Because of that, some truly astonishing buildings, places, and curious construction projects have become abandoned over the years. Here are some of the most amazing examples for your entertainment. The Ashram in Rishikesh, India, was briefly world famous a little over 50 years ago. Found close to the foothills in the Himalayas, pictures of the temple were plastered all over the world's media after it was visited by British musical legends the Beatles in 1968, at the peak of their global fame. Legend has it that they wrote most of the White Album there, as they stayed with their guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Incredibly, almost nobody has made use of the temple since then. Instead of being a religious shrine, it's become a shrine to the band, daubed with graffiti depicting the likenesses and lyrics of the Fab Four. All the glass in the windows has long since been smashed, the doorways are wide open, and in places, the roofs are in the middle of collapsing. The guru passed away in 2008, but it appears that he'd abandoned his former home long before then. It still probably counts as a place of pilgrimage, but only if you're a dedicated devotee of one of the most famous and influential bands who ever lived. Anybody is welcome to come and inspect the Cu Chi tunnels in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, but we wouldn't recommend it if you suffer from claustrophobia. They're a hangover from the Vietnam War, when they provided semi-permanent accommodation to thousands of Vietnamese soldiers, but they were actually built by resistance fighters battling against French occupation of the land during the 1940s. There are more than 75 miles of tunnels below the city, and in places they're still deadly thanks to the booby traps that the Viet Cong planted to discourage American forces from following them down holes. Unfortunately for the Viet Cong, although the tunnels kept them safe for Americans, they exposed them to a whole horde of poisonous snakes and insects. And so by the time of their abandonment, it's believed that up to half of the soldiers based in the tunnels had fallen victim to malaria. An American bombing attack damaged a large stretch of the tunnels beyond the point of use toward the end of the conflict, and they've been abandoned ever since. Sticking with the theme of underground facilities for a moment, there's an amazing old military hospital hiding underneath the ground in Guernsey, one of the British Channel Islands. The island was occupied by German forces during the Second World War, and they forced enslaved locals to build the complex for them. Some of these workers managed to hide messages of defiance along the length of the 23,000 feet of tunnels, which were carved from the solid rock using little more than hand tools. The German side never got to make much use of the complex. Just as it was approaching completion, D-Day happened, and the Germans suffered a defeat from which they would never recover. Around 500 German soldiers who were wounded on D-Day remained in the secret hospital for around 3 months after the event, but it was quickly determined that the dark, damp conditions weren't well suited to helping with the recovery process. The facility was abandoned and subsequently seized by the Allies in 1945. A woman called Joyce Browning now owns the tunnels, but she's left all the original fixtures and fittings inside for the perusal of tourists. When the Chinese government saw the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, they were greatly impressed by it. In fact, they were so impressed by it that they decided to build a replica of it out of concrete. The so-called Baiju aircraft carrier is 800 feet long, 160 feet wide, and 100 feet tall. It's also completely useless as an aircraft carrier. In fact, it's completely useless in every way. The ship was never supposed to sail. It's been built on an artificial lake and is incapable of sailing out to sea. When construction work began in 2003, it was intended that the replica ship would become an entertainment complex with hotels, shops, and movie theaters. But the project ran out of money in 2005, and it was never fully finished. External investors have come and gone in the years since, and no work has been carried out since 2010. An attempt to sell the concrete ship for $20 million in 2012 failed, and so it remains in situ as a somewhat embarrassing white elephant. The most remarkable thing that can be said about the Inchindown oil tanks in the Scottish Highlands is that the depot produces the world's longest echo. Unsurprisingly, that isn't a strong enough attraction to keep the depot open. The storage tanks were built during the Second World War to safeguard British oil supplies and keep them safe from German bombing raids. The site stayed in use until 2002, but after their abandonment, an engineering professor named Trevor Cox visited the site to test a theory. He suspected that the site could produce the world's longest ever recorded echo in a human-made structure, and he was correct. Any sound made inside the longest tank, which is 44 feet tall and double the length of the average football field, echoes for an impressive 112 seconds. Sadly, you can't gain access yourself to repeat Professor Cox's experiment. As a site of former military importance, Inchindown is strictly off-limits to the public. Access is occasionally granted for guided tours carried out by the Forestry Commission of Scotland. Here's another oily abandoned site in the Scottish Highlands. It's the oil rig graveyard of Cromarty Firth. A whole range of enormous steel skeletons dominate the skyline here, but the only visitors they ever receive are the dolphins who sometimes swim around them. Even though the oil industry is still worth countless billions of dollars every year, it's not doing the roaring trade that it was a few short years ago. The decreased price of crude oil has forced the closure of several oil rigs all over the world, and those abandoned rigs need somewhere to go. In Scotland, that place is Cromarty Firth. The 1,000-ton rigs are slowly and carefully dragged to the graveyard from their previous location and left there in the hope that prices will rise, and they can one day be used again. That's why some Scottish oil workers refer to the site as a parking lot instead of a graveyard. But adjusting the name doesn't shake off the feeling that the rigs are totally lifeless, and they're likely to stay that way for a very long time. A conspiracy theorist would say that someone had it in for the so-called end-of-the-world cinema from the day that construction work began on it. The site, found in Qasim Sharm Ash-Sheikh in Egypt, was supposed to be a quirky and unique outdoor cinema, but not one single movie has ever been shown here. Building the cinema was the dream of Frenchman Dean Edel, who set about attempting to realize his vision toward the end of the 1990s. Everything went smoothly, and a crowd gathered for its opening night, at which a special screening of Jurassic Park had been arranged. Just as the film was about to go live, the power generators mysteriously failed. They never turned back on again, and some people say that the local authorities killed the power on the grounds that Edel didn't have the proper licenses to operate a cinema. The 700 sun-baked seats remained standing in the desert for years. In 2018, the site was badly damaged by vandals, and the area was subsequently closed off by the Egyptian government. Presumably, it will soon be demolished. The next stop on our Abandonment World Tour is also in the desert, but it's much, much older than the end-of-the-world cinema. These are the ruins of Haicheng in Aqsa, China, and their walls have been standing since around the year 1032. The site, in the middle of the Inner Mongolian Desert, is about 20 miles from Dailahubu and was once a vital link in the famous Silk Road trade route. In fact, the fortress that stood here was the largest anywhere along the Gansu corridor. Because of its strategic importance, it was a major capture for Genghis Khan and his Mongol hordes when he seized it in 1226. But even under Khan's brutal rule, Haicheng continued to thrive. Marco Polo visited it on his travels and remarked on the isolation and peculiarity of its culture, which he felt was markedly different from anywhere else in the region. The fortress was still in use throughout the Yuan dynasty, which lasted until 1368, but became abandoned during the subsequent Ming dynasty and has remained that way throughout the centuries that have followed. An archaeological dig carried out in the early 1900s uncovered a collection of jiaozi, the earliest paper banknotes in the world. Once upon a time, the land-to-sea cable car in Sidi Ifni, Morocco, was completely unique on the planet. Now it's nothing more than an abandoned curiosity, cut off from the land by the sea and destined to one day crumble into dust. While cable car systems are a common sight in many locations now, there was almost nothing like it when it was constructed during the Spanish occupation of the area during the 1960s. The unusual nature of the coastline at Sidi Ifni makes the waters too shallow for the construction of a standard harbor, and so the sea cable car was devised as a way of ferrying cargo and passengers from the shoreline to ships and back again. You'll still find some rusting remnants of the cables and cars dotted around the coastline, but there's no longer a need for that kind of service in the area, and so the facility has been left to fall apart. Very occasionally, a brave urban explorer will swim or sail their way out to the concrete tower and climb up onto it to get some pictures. Coming across a rustic-looking ruins in the middle of Africa deserts isn't unheard of, and so at first glance you might think that Tunisia's Mos Espa is a site like any other. You'd be wrong though. This isn't an ancient ruin. It's far more modern construction. And if you're a Star Wars fan, you might already have recognized it from these images. This location doubled as Tatooine, and was home to Anakin Skywalker in episodes 1, 2, and 3 of the popular film franchise. The fictional name takes inspiration from the local area. There's a real Tunisian town called Tatooine not far from here. Although some of the finer details of what you see on screen in the films were added in CGI to sell the idea that this is a futuristic seaport, the amount of physical building work undertaken by the film's crew is impressive. They're solid structures, and they're likely to remain standing for several years yet. The biggest threat to their existence comes from the regular sandstorms that sweep through Mos Espa, which are taking their toll on the external walls and beginning to bury some of the smaller buildings. The abandoned site of Alam Ordo in Kyrgyzstan was supposed to be a focal point for the study and celebration of spirituality and science. Instead, it's become a major attraction for urban explorers and curiosity seekers. It's difficult to say whether everything that was supposed to be built here was ever completed or not. All that stands there now is a series of concrete yurts and a long wall connecting them all together that's covered in paintings and murals. There are a few odd-looking statues there too, positioned as if they're standing guard over the forgotten site. Given the level of decay, it might surprise you to find out that Alam Ordo was built as recently as 2009. The whole community of wise elders was supposed to live permanently in the yurts and welcome younger visitors who would come to learn important life lessons from them. This was a dream of then-President Kurmanbek Bakiev, but Bakiev was forced out of power by the Second Kyrgyz Revolution in 2010. His successor had no interest in completing any of his projects, and so Alam Ordo was never spoken of again in corridors of power. For the train enthusiasts among you, Istvántalek train yard in Budapest has to be considered a must-see site, which makes it something of a shame that access is only granted to those who have documented permission from the Hungarian government. To fans of locomotives around the world, the site is better known as the Red Star Graveyard, and it's hiding a few grisly secrets. It's thought that some of the rusting old locomotives stored here were used to transport Jewish prisoners to meet their fate during the Holocaust. The complex was built in the early 1900s as a repair yard, and in the distant southern reaches of the site, there's a repair facility still in operation, but the vast majority of the buildings and engines here are long abandoned and forgotten. The majority of the trains date back to Hungary's Soviet era, hence the Red Star nickname, and were supposed to be repaired before being sent on to the city's railway museum. Sadly, it looks like the work required to make them presentable is never going to be carried out. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.